where will the world's tallest building be in the year 2050, and why? You can pick a city, country, or region.
Yeah, of course. Well, it is difficult to project and speculate, as you know,
Sure.
35 years into the future. But having said that, if we had asked the same questions to ourselves 35 years ago, probably the answer may not have been Dubai, Jeddah, Kuala Lumpur, or Singapore for that matter, you know. Having said that, perhaps we should look at where the next action may be, or where the next potential future may be. And I feel that it might be in South America, it might be in Africa, or it might be even in Eastern Europe, including Turkey maybe. I mean, Turkey is sort of partially Europe as well. I would say potentially Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Mexico City, Mexico, or maybe Abuja in Nigeria, or possibly Istanbul in Turkey. You know, this is my speculation.
Sure.
Maybe a tallest building, and as you know, the reasons for the tall buildings to happen in any part of the world are multiple. It's not a singular reason, multiple reasons. One is population growth. Second is constraints, land constraint. Third is economy. Fourth is potentially a ego of an individual who wants to push for things and make a statement, governmental policies, and so on and so forth. I feel that these places here may have some of these ingredients in the brewing right now, but who knows, you know.
Right.
We will have to wait and see, you know.
Yeah, but new frontiers then, probably.
The new frontier is the right word, actually. That's what I was looking for.
Right.
What is the next frontier? And I think Africa clearly indicates that as a possibility, you know. So we'll see.
I've heard Africa mentioned before, and I hadn't heard Turkey mentioned, and I think that's an interesting.
Well, I mean, you know, the Turkey is the reason for Turkey is I tell you something. We're doing a work in Istanbul, and I have done some work in Istanbul, and one of my partners, Dan Kaplan, is designing a tower which is almost built there. And every time I go to Istanbul, by the way, I see more flags in that one city than any city I see in the world. And some of the biggest flags I have ever seen are flown in Istanbul. That shows a pride of nation, pride of people. That's one of the ingredients, by the way, for which is essential, you know, like the China has that as well.
Right, and you could picture a building with an iconic name like the Ottoman Tower. Or
something of that nature.
Yeah, Ataturk Tower.
It's Ataturk Tower might be the right name. They are into Ataturk, by the way, and for good reasons, you know. I mean, it modernized the country, and it's their nation, it's their pride, you know.
So another big picture question we had for you and a few other people was, what would your ideal future city look like?
Yeah. Well, another good and challenging question. From my point of view, by the way, cities are essentially a combination of districts and communities and also neighborhoods, you know. On a fundamental level, a city is where we work, we live, we play, we entertain, we get entertained, and then with, of course, supporting ingredients that we need, such as some cities have started to grow food now, you know, the food and harvesting water and so on and so forth. So my notion of an ideal city is probably creating a modules of a satellite cities, which would be dense and vertical, because we have no choice anymore. And these satellites cities could be probably connected by superfast train systems and probably a good road transportation system as well, but surrounded by enormous natural landscape or a ground, which means we would conserve basically the natural resources and preserve the land instead of having the sprawl going all over and leaving nothing, for imagination in the future,
And by satellite cities, you mean one central business district and then several other
No,
nodes?
I mean each satellite is completely self-sufficient. So it has the business district and residential, and it has to be a mixed use to make it happen. It's a self-sufficient module of a satellite city, which grows food, so you work there, you live there, and you raise your children there and raise your families as well. And that's the key, by the way. And once, if we can accomplish that, it would basically, potentially can allow us to not have car use unless you're driving for more than 3 hours, distance is more than 3 hours, for example, or you only fly when the distance is more than 3 hours, as an example. And your daily commute might be reduced to maybe 30 minutes instead of sometime 2 and 3 hours these days.
Yeah.
And that itself would be quite an accomplishment if we can do that, as well. And a good example of that, recently I was looking at some examples for this. There is, from 12th century to 20th century in China, there were some developments in areas called Fujian, Tolo. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. And if you look at that their organization, it's like circles and squares, and they were all sort of densely packed, not vertical, leaving enough land around. And so they were very respectful of the land and the use of the land, And so that notion, or imagine Siena or Vienna or Venice becoming more vertical, which has that potential. I mean, this is just a thought on my part.
Sure, sure.
Am I making any sense?
Oh yeah. Well, sort of the two extremes: very dense cityscapes, and then immediately outside, very natural areas.
Correct. And by the way, I mean, if you look at even the middle-aged cities like Siena, it's pretty dense. Or if you look at many of the cities of the Renaissance time or older times, even older times than that, the cities were dense, They were not vertical.
Right.
That was the difference, Now, because of the population growth,
Right.
we may have to embrace verticality at the same time.
Interesting.
And of course, the transportation and modern technologies and infuse the modern and capitalize on that as well,
What are some of the features of vernacular architecture in the parts of the world where you work? And I know you've worked all over, so you can pick one good example or talk more generally about the topic, but how do you incorporate local cultural elements and history into tall building design and development?
That's very challenging, by the way. I think my opinion right now is that it's the climate and it's the culture which would continue to differentiate between a place to place. And if we as architects and professionals who deal with built environments, and not just us, by the way, engineers, architects, all the professionals, if we can collectively be very sort of aware of it and be respectful of it, perhaps the cities might in the future look again bit different from one to the other place, like they used to at one time, And so I'm still hopeful, I'm still optimistic.
Is this something you grapple with when you work in a new part of the world?
Every time. And for example, if I am doing a building in India, it's dealt with very differently in terms of the architectural language and vocabulary and the needs of it. If I'm doing a building in Middle East, it's done very differently. If I'm doing a building in New York, it's done very differently. And cultural aspect, by the way, there are subtleties, which influence the design quite a bit, I mean, to give you a very small example of it, for example, the issue of privacy in residential components or public sector is so different from place to place.
Yeah.
Everyone uses computers these days, so work methodologies are getting very similar in some ways. We all seem to speak the same language, and yet we don't speak the same language, which is very interesting. And in terms of privacy, I'll give you a simple example. A very small example of it, but it influences planning, it influences design. Like for example, public toilets or toilets in U.S.
Sure.
They they have the partitions,
Right.
and the partitions are raised from the floor, and they are not necessarily touching the ceilings.
Mm-hmm.
Middle East, you can't do that
Has
because
to be.
their sense of privacy is to have a clear enclosed room,
Mm-hmm.
and to a point where they do not like the idea of even transfer of a sound.
Mm-hmm.
That privacy is taken that seriously.
It's more absolute.
Yeah, it's absolute, and one has to be respectful of it. You can't fight it. Or you go to India, it's very similar. There may not be a separation of men and women, as it is in the Middle East, but the sense of privacy is still there.
Hmm.
I mean so it's very critical to think in those terms.
Right.
Ventilation, for example, natural ventilation in many parts of the world is still considered as essential,
Mm-hmm.
and some parts it is not.
Right.
So
Some
you
parts
ha-
it's almost discouraged.
it's almost discouraged. So what do? So you have to be respectful of that.
Mm.
And so I mean we have designed bridges, by the way, and in that cultural influences, I mean I designed a bridge in Dubai, for example, and one of the influences we had was I always liked the Arabian calligraphy in terms of formal sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I interpreted that into the building, the form of the bridge, and created the lighting based on the lunar calendar, which was interesting way to interpret culture into a modern infrastructure project such as bridges.
Right. Ancient history.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
modern
exactly.
infrastructure.
But interpreted, it's
Yeah,
interpreted in
of
a
course.
modern way.
You mentioned building in India, and I wanted to ask you why India hasn't seen the tall building boom like China.
The reasons for that are quite a few. It's not a singular reason. Um, Economy is clearly, from my point of view, is not as strong as it is China.
Mm-hmm.
It is a democratic political structure. It has massive. She has massive bureaucracy, antiquated regulations. Sometimes they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they are negotiated as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a huge amount of time to get anything done in India. That's my experience so far, by the way.
Yeah.
Poor infrastructure and very poor public transportation system as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I grew up in India, by the way, and 50 years ago, I couldn't take what's called the subway system in Mumbai because it was always crowded. And today, I can't even go near it.
Because it's that much more crowded.
It is that much more crowded, and it's that much more. I mean, it works on some level, but it's very crowded. It's not. So the infrastructure is still poor. The transportation is poor.
These problems are probably pretty widely recognized, though. Is there a desire to build tall in India, or is that also not there?
I think India is inching towards that. But by the way, other few reasons, key important reason is like FSI or FAR, depending on where you are in the part of the world.
Sure, floor area ratio.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Floor area ratio or floor space index, they call it in India.
Gotcha.
Is pretty low for even cities like Mumbai. And so therefore it prohibits you from going taller as well. I mean, it's changing. Attitudes are changing. The construction also, the quality of construction, the embracing tectonics is also still way behind. And to do a tall building, unless you're able to embrace the tectonics of modern construction technologies and materials, it's a bit challenging.
It's a huge risk.
Yeah, I mean, you can't use, let's call it bricks or concrete block in very tall buildings.
Right.
Because they have to be, it has to be light construction, as well to reduce the dead load.
Yeah.
And so these are some of the reasons, by the way.
I wonder, since those are all such big, seemingly intractable problems, if if and when India does start building more tall buildings, it'll be more gradual, and it won't be the sort of explosive proliferation that you've seen in China and some other areas of the Middle East, where it was suddenly, overnight it seemed to be towers springing up everywhere. Maybe in India, if that happens, if in 50 or 100 years there are a lot of tall buildings and very dense skyscrapers in Indian cities, maybe it will have happened in a different way, more organically.
I think it would be more organically. I think I happen to agree with you. It will be more organic. I think it would be over a little bit at a slower pace than it happened in Middle East or in China. That's what I think, but who knows,
Sure.
Mumbai is already planning tall buildings, by the way, of 80 stories and and so on and so forth. But they are far and fewer in between, And but we will see. The time will tell where this will all head,
Yeah, and I think on the subject of time will tell, I wanted to ask you about environmental issues too. One question that's rather open-ended that I've been asking a lot of people is, can we build our way out of environmental crises?
We have no choice. We must and we have to. Having said that, it's also very clear, by the way, the current LEED standards or any of the standards which are adopted worldwide for environmental reasons and for energy savings and all the other criteria that we apply are by themselves not sufficient to avoid the crisis. We'll have to go beyond that. And so therefore my opinion is living with less should be the mantra of the future for all of us. It's not you or me. It's no longer you or me, It's about us in many ways, And we all have to sort of adopt to this idea of living with less. As you know, Ed Masria initiated in 2030 a challenge for net zero. Recently, at a summit of 124 countries, by the way, 2050 imperative was adopted to basically declaring elimination of or emission of CO2
within the built
in
environment.
the built environment.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly helpful. I think that is something that we can all be proud of, and I think is going to help us a lot. So we are heading in the right direction.
Yeah.
I think the passive ideas, using less, embracing density, saving energy, water, conserving land and resources, and all the good things we all talk about, if we implement them on a very individual basis in our own small way, instead of having 50 shirts, why not have 40 shirts, on a very simple level. I think that may have an impact,
How do you think the built environment, or you as an architect, can influence that? I mean, a lifestyle change on that level, does the city planner, does the architect have a role to play in pushing that along?
We certainly have a lot to sort of influence, at least, There's always that challenge between clients or some institutions or anybody wanting more, And I think it's our obligation to sort of influence their thinking. That iconic nature of the buildings doesn't necessarily mean extremely grand, It can be still iconic.
Right.
It can be still done very well to serve society,
Yeah.
and still accomplish pretty much a lot of that thing as well. And of course, we do, by the way, routinely repositioning of buildings, which is a part of our practice a little bit. We do recycle materials. We do all the basic things that all architects do. And we go beyond that as well,
Right.
And that's the key, I think.
Yeah. To that point of influencing people's thinking on living with less, I guess, do you think the traditional horizontal city of the past has something to teach the new vertical cities we're trying to build and talking about at this conference?
I think they do. I think they have a lot to teach. The horizontal cities in the past, especially horizontal cities which were dense, by the way, they taught us few things, and those were within that constraint that they faced, they found a way to make sure that essentials were not compromised. Essentials being a daylight, essential being merging with nature, essentials being conserving land, essentials being conserving resources, essentials being sense of aesthetics, and creating spaces which are sort of inspiring for us as people, and are also equally great for raising families, you know. And so all of those things which the earlier cities taught us could essentially be done vertically as well, in my view, you know. I mean, there is nothing that can stop us from doing that. I mean, optimization daylight is, we can do it. It doesn't matter it's horizontal or vertical, you know.
Right.
And actually today I'm speaking about these issues, and the issues, what I call them as subjective issues, which matter.
Like what?
Say daylight or landscape or
Okay.
nature or
Sure.
human scale or relative scale, or all of these issues matter, because that's what creates the environment, you know, for us to be comfortable with and within, and that's what keeps us healthier, you know. That's my view of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Unless there's something else we didn't get to that you'd like to discuss, I think that's probably good.
Well, you maybe we should talk about one other subject,
Sure.
if you have a few more minutes, you know.
Yeah, we have a couple.
Yeah, if you have a couple of minutes, yeah. In China, there are a lot of new areas are popping up all over the places.
New cities?
Yeah, new cities, and particularly new vertical cities. So on some level, density is embraced here, and which is a good thing. I mean,
Right.
when you come to Shanghai, I mean, you can't tell people in Shanghai that density is bad. I mean, they have already embraced it. They've taken
Right.
it to such a high level.
Mm-hmm.
Have created amazing environment here as well.
Public transit.
Yeah, public transportation. All good things are happening here. Of course, some bad things are happening as well at the same time. But
Yeah.
they're making enormous progress. But the new places which are popping up all over the places, I think they need to learn from their old traditional cities from China. And just to give you a few pointers on that, the China is a big country, has tremendous regions, have tremendous variation within the traditional cities. But I did some research on the southeastern part of China and their traditional cities, and discovered following, by the way. In the old traditional city of this part of the world here, used to have a wall around the city.
Mm-hmm.
And within the city, then the communities did not have walls. All the new areas that are popping up are gated communities within the city,
Right.
and the city has no wall.
Mm-hmm.
So it reverses itself, and therefore the communities don't link with each other and have lesser of a, so they can learn that from that. In the old traditional cities here of this part, the body of water was used very cleverly, and sometimes they were used for even transportation, by the way, within areas like Suzhou is not too far from here, which seems to be missing as well in some of these new areas which are popping up.
Water is still
Yeah.
used mostly for disposal.
Yeah, it's more, or it's used
Transportation.
for just for landscape, a little bit of landscape
Sure.
sort of elements, rather than on a bigger scale, you know, which would become then, because that creates this you know, spatial aspects in the cities, which makes it very pleasant.
Right.
And the old traditional cities in China, by the way, which is very interesting, at least in this part, was followed an orthogonal geometric pattern for the city, and within that they used to have an sort of non-orthogonal pattern. So therefore, city had an order on a broader scale, and then within the communities it created more organic living approach.
Right.
The newer things that are popping up all over the places seem to do orthogonal system at both levels,
Right.
creating a monotony, you know,
Mm.
and therefore less friendly environment or lesser interesting spaces
Less humanistic.
and less humanistic and getting pretty intense actually in some ways, you know.